All right, Alexander, take her away.
Cool. Thanks, Pat. Can you all hear me okay? I'm trying out these earbuds. Good.
Great.
Okay, cool.
Sounding great.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I read this paper about a month ago and thought it was interesting and thought might be a nice discussion starter for the group. So yeah, Pat asked me to just do a brief overview of the paper. And so I just have some notes I'll run through. I don't have anything shared or to share, but if we want to look at, I think there's only like one figure or two figures, we can look at those. But okay, I'll just run through it. So yeah, this is Conkle et al. From 2018. And the focus of their paper was on open, reproducible research. And I'll come back to that a little bit later where they actually define what that means. A few points to start with. Notice it's reproducible versus replicable, right? So in this paper, they're focusing on computational reproducibility, as opposed to even other types of reproducibility, but definitely as opposed to replicability. So just briefly to differentiate those two, replicability is essentially being able to run similar tests to test similar hypotheses and end up with the same results across different studies. That'd be something that's replicable. Reproducible is being able to come up with the same exact results, giving the same data and methods from the beginning. So they're focused on that latter one. On their research questions summarized is essentially, what do active researchers in computational geosciences understand open reproducible research to mean, and what obstacles do they encounter? To address this question, they did a few different survey techniques. So they did an online survey, a series of semi-structured interviews, and also a smaller focus group to talk about these. And then they also, to complement those studies, looked at how reproducible are modern studies in the computational geosciences. And so they picked a subset of papers from 2017, 2018, or 2016, 2017, and looked at how well they could reproduce the figures from those studies. Okay, so just going to jump forward to results here. From their focus group, they came up with an open reproducible research definition from the group, which I thought I would just read because I thought it was helpful. So abbreviating it from here on is ORR. ORR contains a detailed description of the methodology and provides access to data, model, and code. Readers can achieve consistent results by repeating the analysis. This then leads to research being more transparent because readers have a better understanding of how results were achieved and which limitations they have. Some obstacles that came out of the focus group and the various surveys, and this is fully documented in Table 1. Papers often insufficiently described methods that prevents reproduction of other researchers' results. Materials such as data or even proprietary code is inaccessible, proprietary software being things like MATLAB or ArcGIS, etc. And finally, it can be time consuming to make a paper and everything that went into it open and reproducible. Time consuming to put it all together, to make it legible for other people. I mean, make it legible for yourself is one thing, but getting it to a place where other people can read and fully follow everything, it takes time. It does. Okay, so now moving into the computational reproducibility aspect. So they examined 39 papers, which were described and were published as open access papers between January 2016 and August 2017. All of these papers had code that was written in R, and they were published in either the Copernicus publications. I think that's a bunch of different journals, but under that group, or it was published in the Journal of Statistical Software. So they attempted to run each paper's code in a clean computational environment. They used a Docker image to do that. They produced figures using all of that code and then compared those figures to those that were in the publications. So they weren't really looking at data, so to like how exact were the data from the paper versus what they produced, but just the figures that come out of those data. They found a mean of 4.4 issues per paper, with issues varying in degree of severity. And those types of issues that they encountered are documented in Table 2. I'll just run through them really quickly. So starting with technical issues where they couldn't get the code to fully run, a lot of these they were able to resolve with either through their own efforts or through contacting the authors, but not all of them. Some minor issues in code execution would be that the library that was called within a code wasn't found, but it was available in the repository. These didn't require any code manipulation to fix them. Moving on to substantial issues where there was some code manipulation required, such as pointing to the wrong directory or there was a missing or deprecated function being called. And leading into the most, it's called severe issues, the highest degree of issue that required a deeper understanding of the source code to fix them, but they were able to still resolve these for the most part. And these include things like missing data or code, flawed functionality. One other issue, is they also classified some issues as being system dependent. This could be that there was not enough RAM on their computer to run the program, or that it used operating system specific libraries, which required some time to fix. So in the figures, they found that cosmetic differences were very common. They found these out of 97 figures they produced, they found cosmetic differences in 78 of them, such as a different plot aspect ratio or different line widths, those sorts of minor things. But they also found that deeper differences were common as well. And they found deeper differences like different curves being graphed on plots, things of that nature that really affect the interpretation of the figure. They found those in 46 of 97. So almost half of the figures that reproduced had those issues. And remember, these are papers that were self-described as being open access. So they, in theory, should be more reproducible than papers in general, right? So we can imagine this issue is only worse across the entire literature. Okay, so I'm going to move into the discussion and finally the conclusions, which I think is the most useful part of the paper. But briefly in the discussion, from their surveys, they found that researchers are often confusing ORR with replicability. And they found that there's only a very small number of researchers who regularly attempt to reproduce other researchers' work. It was 7% of their respondents. Only 2 papers that they looked at were executable without any issues. That's 2 out of 40 or so. And they found the biggest obstacles to ORR being openness of the software, of the code, of the data, and provide some thoughts on that in the discussion. But finally, moving into the conclusions, they propose 8 guidelines for computational reproducibility. These are things that if you've looked at this or looked at other organizations involved in open access research, they're pretty common guidelines, but they're nicely put together here. So I was just going to run through them briefly. The first guideline is to embed and install libraries within the source code and include version numbers of any packages that you use. The second is to make directories relative to a top directory in your repository, rather than, for instance, keeping the path name to a given data set as it was on your computer, make it relative to the repository where you're going to store it, right? Do not modify the source code once results are copied into the paper, because you never know what you might accidentally change. 4, execute the code in a clean computational environment like a Docker image before you publish to make sure that everything works as you expect it to. 5, be sure to publish the input data as well as the process data that's used in the figures so that readers can discern whether any deviations in the figures are the result of system-specific settings or result of deviations in the data analysis that was performed. Number 6, encapsulate code and data in a project folder to facilitate execution. And they make reference to this executable research compendium. So that's a really fancy term, but from what I found reading that paper it refers to, they're referencing an executable like something that you can run in a Docker image, but within that you include all of your user interface bindings, all the documentation, all the software, all the data in a standardized, easy to read directory format. Number 7, provide the code and data as original files, not as text in a PDF, which would require copying and pasting. And finally, 8, when making your figures, use the code to produce and design them so that it's reproducible, and even better, embed them in executable documents like a Jupyter notebook in Python or R, Markdown, etc., things like that. Okay, so that's, yeah, that was the paper. I have some, I don't know, I guess we could just open it up if anyone has thoughts, or how should we do this, Pat?
Yeah, any initial thoughts, questions? I have one. So reproducibility, replicability. I haven't heard of this distinction before, and I'm kind of interested in it. So I want to make sure I understand. So reproducibility is exact same results, right? So someone writes a paper and I get the exact same figures. That's reproducibility, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And then
with the exact same data.
Yeah, with the exact same data. Replicability is taking their methods and applying it to something slightly different or extending it. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think so.
I did understand that then. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's standard across subject domains also.
Yeah.
There's a large literature on what's called the reproducibility crisis in MRI literature.
MRI meaning
magnetic
like
resonance imaging,
yeah, scanning.
not
yeah.
major infrastructure.
Yeah.
So just out of curiosity, I didn't see any mention of singularity in the paper. That's probably a really big oversight.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
so
they have containers in Docker, which is, comparable, but I do
not
agree.
Really. And that's the problem, because most Docker containers are distributed via Docker Hub, and so you end up with multiple versions in Docker Hub. So unless you're providing signatures for every layer in the Docker Hub, you're not going to be guaranteed of getting the same software that you got when they built the Docker image. Singularity has the advantage that it becomes a single static file that can be distributed and executed. And there's no question of whether you've got different versions or not. They're right there inside in the container. It also answers the questions about having directory names the same, because you can give it directory names that are inside the container that can be mapped to directories that are totally different from one run to the other on the outside of the container. So that way you don't have to change any of the code to make it runnable on your own system. That was our preferred way to do it, because if we give somebody a bunch of raw data files, some instruction files, and a singularity image, and they have singularity, it should basically just run and produce the same thing regardless on every system. And at least with the studies where they took my advice, we did that before we published. Right. The nice thing about doing it with singularity is it also makes it easier to do all of this stuff. It's harder to build in some ways the initial image. If you go back to the native singularity build process. But if you're more comfortable with Docker, you can build it in a Docker container. And then it's an easy conversion to go from Docker to Singularity. And then you can copy your Singularity image and test that everything still comes out right. Does that help?
So you do that too, Bennett, huh? You build in Docker and then make a Singularity image.
I don't, because I started with Singularity and we've never installed Docker on a cluster because it was rife with security problems.
Yeah, it still is.
And so I got used to using Singularity from scratch. It was quite the culture shock when Docker decided to go from the Docker file to the layer format, because it's a lot harder to just copy the text, right? If I had a Docker file, it was really easy to copy the text from the Docker file and convert it to a Singularity definition file, because the commands were essentially the same. But with the layering, that's a lot different. But I think of Singularity as a way of locking everything down and ensuring then that your software is no longer changing. And in a couple of cases, we created the Singularity image, and then all of the graduate students and the postdocs who are working on the research study were required to use the Singularity image for all of the analyses that they were presenting internally to discussion groups within the project, but also then for the published data, for the published papers. So imposing that discipline at the outset makes getting the study up and running potentially a little more difficult. But once it's done, it makes documenting it and then making the open, whatever the OO something or other, OSS, it's a lot easier because it's all done already for you, right? And your internal how-tos can essentially be put into the distribution without a lot of change. That was my experience for what it was worth from working with people at Michigan and a couple of other places.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing all that, Bennett. I mean, Singularity also has the advantage of itself being an open source software. Is that right? Whereas Docker is
it's a little weird now because, I mean, it is like other open source software. It's forked. And so there's the Singularity Community Edition, and then there's the Aptainer version, which started with they started from a common GitHub hash ID. And then they switched, they went off on the side. That was largely driven by philosophy. Singularity stuck with, they want to be a commercially viable company. And Aptainer wants to be, they're sort of religious about open sourcing. But I have yet to run into any differences in results that are traceable to using Singularity over Aptainer or Aptainer over Singularity.
Gotcha.
It would seem to me there's layers to this for reproducibility. If you're going to basically capture a complete environment and drag that around, it also locks you to old libraries.
It does, yes.
Yes, but that's not necessarily what everybody wants to do, because libraries get updated for reasons. Libraries have issues.
Sure.
If you find that your results are not reproducible with the newest version of a particular library, perhaps it's because the library was flawed when you had your publication. So we need to be able to unlayer it at least. And I'm not familiar enough with singularities, whether I can choose to then take that image and upgrade libraries or move libraries up to say, I'd like to try that with the newer release and see if, something's been fixed, which broke your analysis.
Right. That's a super great point. But what you're talking about now is reproducibility, or is replicability, not reproducibility. Because you're changing the parameters of the study, which is the versions of the software.
And there's a scope on that reproducibility. I want to reproduce the data and your algorithms with the flexibility to use a newer version of the underlying libraries, or a different kernel, or a different, I want to, if you're using Python, you got, different drops of Python, or I'm sure R has similarly, they have different upgrades, updates. So yes, there's reproducibility, but you got to draw the boundary someplace, it seems.
Right.
That being able to reproduce your input data and your source code on your list of libraries, but not necessarily the exact version number of the library, that's still reproducibility, I would think.
It is reproducibility, but it is not replicability.
Well, replicability to me says I want to do it on a different data set. I want to do it, you did it for August. I want to replicate your design on maybe a different lake, or I want to replicate your design on a different year.
I think that's the reverse of what they're trying to say the definitions of the two terms are. Oh, wait, maybe I
Reproducibility
have
seems
it
like
backwards.
it's reproduce exactly what you did with exactly your data. Replicability says I want to expand it and use a slightly different data set.
Yeah. Okay, so
Yeah.
I think I had them reversed, but I think my point remains the same, right? If you give me your software and your data, I put it on my machine, I should be able to get the same results that you did, flawed or not. But then if I want to make a version that has got updated versions of the library and the R language and everything else, that is then in the other category.
Yes,
And
that's
there's a
replicating.
slightly different way that you would want to document how to do that versus just getting the same thing I got.
Right. And somehow I'd think there'd be two different categories of replication for replicating with only some library changes versus replicating with different input data sets.
Right.
Yeah.
The one study that I worked on where that really became an issue, the people who wanted to do the replication, right? So they wanted to do their own data using the published methods. They wanted first to make sure that they had implemented the methods correctly on their computers, and that they wanted to do that by running the original data through their installation. And they spent a month going back and forth with the original authors because they weren't getting the same results. And it turned out that the code had actually been updated, which you mentioned earlier, and that what they had to do was revert to an earlier Git checkout ID for the code in order to get the right results. But then the published results were published based on uncorrected code, and so that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yep, and I think that would seem to be what the research process should be. That says, oh, this is a promising publication. Let me see if I can at least, let's start with reproducing what they did, and now let me bring it up to the level of software that I'm using and see if it still works.
Right.
And now let me give it my data set or my whatever, and see if I can generalize it to be able to cite this paper as supporting evidence for something I'm doing.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all good. I like it. We Alexandra and I were in a presentation earlier this month. NASA came to UVM and did basically a similar thing from a NASA viewpoint, but basically how do you push people towards open reproducible research. They have this, they call it TOPS, TOPS. Open publishable science, maybe is what it was, the OPS part of it. I don't remember. I'd have to go look up what the acronym was. But it was good.
It's kind of a weird deal. Saying, Scott. Yeah.
What's that?
It is transform to open science, I think. Okay. Is what that stands for. Yeah.
But it was similar. How do you incent folks to share and lock in, what they, everything was in this paper basically, but it's just from a different source. They were basically pushing folks to have initiatives, and it sounds as if, and this paper referenced it, that there's a move towards requiring that for a lot of publications now. A lot of journals saying that you have to provide enough information so that our readers can reproduce what you're asserting, which I think is a good step in the right direction. There are concerns. There's data differential privacy. There's data sensitivity. There's there's all sorts of caveats on that. And they did say in that seminar that it's acceptable to say that you are reproducible, even if you need to go and sign some non-disclosure agreements or whatever to get access to the input data. It doesn't have to be published on a website. It just means it has to be a process by which you can get it. So,
yeah. And Scott, just to build off that, it's not just the journals, but a lot of funders, especially I think the federal government it's now law that as much as possible, things published that were funded by the U.S. government have to be open access.
Yeah, I've done
so-
10 years worth of NSF grants through EPSCoR,
Yeah.
and they want everything to be out there eventually. There's a
Yeah.
there's a timeline, there's a pipeline, and I don't know where we are in that pipeline for the last grant, but getting everything out there. We need to publish.
And
Yeah.
NIH has set up a data. I mean, they've set up an entire data infrastructure for people to archive the data that are being used to publish based on NIH grants. And that's very similar to the non-disclosure agreement that typically you'll see with people who've got human subjects, especially with HIPAA data. The journals are fighting with this because the journals are trying to figure out what can they actually require that is reasonable. I have a friend who's an editor at one of the scientific journals, and they're still trying to figure out how they're going to be able to get this out there and make people right. But yeah, you're right. It's definitely one of the coming things. It's not an easy problem.
Yeah, all
So
this
Scott,
is kind of tangential to one of the questions I thought of, and it's only been 7 years now since this paper was published. But I was, just wondering what the results would look like if this was done today, because of the increased push for this. People are doing it more. Researchers just have more experience doing it now. Several years of doing this are probably better at it, and of course, the funding agencies now require it. I don't know. I'm not sure anyone is going to do this, but
Well,
just
maybe
wonder
we
if
should try
more
to
than-
replicate the results. Do another survey.
sounds like a lot of work, man. 40 papers.
Yes, and
probably
they
two
did working groups
would
and
work.
surveys.
Yeah.
And
Right. Yeah.
Sounds like the perfect way to indoctrinate students. Here, take this paper and make it work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
graduates-
Alexander, I had a similar thought, and I wonder what would happen if you did this with a different programming language.
I
Right.
knew you were going to come up with that.
Yeah.
Some of them are more rigorous than others, for sure.
Some of them are harder to do, right? I mean, if you compare R and Python, the version differences in R libraries look really stable compared to Python. And R library versioning looks really, really unstable compared to C++ versions. Right? So
Yeah,
the more
So-
fundamental the language, I think the more stable its base is going to be and the more likely you're going to be able. But on the other hand, you've also got to compile it and you've got to run it on some set of libraries. And so that's, I think, where the containers really come in.
Yeah, ultimately, if you don't have the source code for every layer of your stack, you're at the whim of wherever you got your download from.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
in
then
some sense, the hardware matters too. I mean, just remember the Excel bug?
Oh yeah, GPUs change.
Yeah, but I would actually flip that on its head. Like, I don't think it's whether it's easier to do open source. I think or open science. I think part of the problem is what programming languages make it easier to not do it, right? So, like, when you make a figure in R, like, I don't know many students, when I watch them recreate a figure in R for me, that open up a file and click run. They highlight this part of code, and they go down and they highlight that part of code. They go down and highlight that part of code, like every freaking time. Like I've
Like using
never
MATLAB.
seen, I can honestly say I've never seen a student run an R script, the whole thing from top to bottom. And when I do it, that's what I do because I'm a structured programmer and I was taught if you didn't do it that way, you were a bad programmer. So it's just baked in my brain. So, but and I think Jupyter notebooks are kind of in the middle there, right? Like there's a cell idea. So at least now your segments are kind of, have boundary boxes on them. I still see students like, run the first cell and then the sixth cell and then the third cell. That's still, I would say, a little bit better because you aren't just like highlighting random pieces of code. So I think there's something to say, to like some programming languages have the structure baked into it and you can't vary from that. And that kind of makes reproducing it a little bit easier than these modern programming languages and modern development methods that allow you to kind of jump around and kind of forget how to do it and then try to explain that to somebody when they try to reproduce it.
Yeah, I think that's probably most apparent in those visualizations, because folks are tweaking the titles and the axis labels and the tick marks and the color maps until they get something that meets the review process, whatever it is they're going through to get something into the publication.
Right.
Whether that's been captured and it's in your repository that you also submitted with that publication. This might be the 10th revision on that graph that you've done since you tried to get this thing published for the first time.
Yeah. So I think there's also a problem, especially with Jupyter, is that Jupyter has no computational capability at all. It's just a front end to submitting. I mean, it's a front end for submitting commands in Python. And the number of times that I've run into issues where, because people can't get their Jupyter notebook to run because they were running the cells out of order and an import statement in a later cell hasn't been executed when they try to rerun it.
Yep.
Or they get different results and they forget that they imported a different version of a library the first time that they ran it and got what they wanted. And then they didn't the second time, and
or they ran it with a different kernel. They swapped the kernel
Yes.
for the one that they got their good graph with, but now that the kernel is not the default kernel, and that's not what they get the next time they load the notebook.
Yeah. Sharia, please, you got your hand up.
I was just going to chime in on the Jupyter Notebook stuff. We recently ran a workshop where we kind of got some real hand experience on some of the issues that people could run into with kernel swapping, with library versions mismatching, and the whole shebang, Python versions not matching up. So our computational team that helped us from Kwasi had the idea of using YAML files just because we were running a conda-based environment anyways. So that kind of predefined all the versions, library versions, Python versions, so as to not get people's local environments messing up their code usage. Along the same lines, I think we used a cloud-based platform anyway. So that kind of, navigates away from the whole your Python versions or your libraries are not matching this certain version of TensorFlow library or any of the other libraries that may already exist. Along the lines of Jupyter Notebook being front end, I have found that sometimes using Google Colab, if your data set's small enough, is better. It's because you don't have to worry about library versions and stuff like that along the same lines. I feel like it was seamless for us in running that workshop because we defined we had help in creating a YAML file, which was easy to import and execute for everyone running that workshop. That part of it seemed pretty seamless. I know that for Python, I guess you could use Google Colab if it's a small enough data set. Similarly, for R, we have RStudio Online, which gives you very low bandwidth in the free version, but it is something that's offered on a cloud-based platform if your data set's small enough. So I feel like cloud-based solutions or even predefined library packages, even creating your own class of libraries and then just making it publicly available for people who want to use it may be good. Also, they use README files, visual and graphical instructions. It's a lot more easy for people to comprehend and follow, as opposed to us trying to describe in papers or disclaimers afterwards of how people can try and navigate code reproducibility from GitHub repositories. Just having a README file there is pretty convenient for them to, do quirky little things like define specific library versions while they're running this code, or even give directions on how this code can be replicated to other data sets that people may want to apply the same code to.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, my only concern with this is that cloud-based versions are susceptible to change without any notice to the user. And similarly, I haven't run into it recently, and there are, Lord knows, there's plenty of Python that doesn't really do anything that is going to be numerical, that where I would be worried about round off error or propagating error through multiple layers of computation. But we have, especially in a decade ago, seen fairly significant differences, depending on whether people are running on a Red Hat based system or a Debian based system, right? Just the underlying operating system math library implementations can cause issues. I have a PowerPoint presentation that was given, wow, it could be as much as 7 years ago now, for an MRI conference that I attended. And they actually did some of this, where what they were trying to figure out was, where do the computational differences come when you're analyzing MRI data? And they were, for example, taking the same MATLAB code and running it on MATLAB on Ubuntu, running it on MATLAB on Red Hat, running different versions of MATLAB. And differences could be as much as off by as much as 12% and be very significant. And this is especially true if you're dealing with simulation methods that have got a random component. So, and it gets even worse if you introduce parallelism, right? Because then the order of operations can really matter as well. And there were some report outs on, here are some things you can do to minimize potential numerical variation in simulation results. That might be kind of fun. I'll see if I can dig that up and send it to Patrick for redistribution.
MATLAB's also fun because, this bit me recently. Well, it bite me. I knew about this, fortunately. Otherwise, I would have been really confused. But I got MATLAB from a Mac user, and then I tried running it on Windows and Linux, and none of it worked because on Mac, the order of the array indices is backwards. So I just had to
column
swap.
major versus row major.
Yeah. So I just had to switch my I's and J's to J's and I's, and it worked. And I remembered that from like back in the day, but fortunately it was back in that memory bank somewhere. Because otherwise I would have been ripping my hair off for a while trying to wonder why this MATLAB code from a Mac user didn't run. So again, platform's important, and I think I think programming languages are important too in terms of like being able to run in different platforms. And I thought it was super interesting how some of these errors were, like running R on Windows versus Linux. We run into this all the time. Some of you on this call and I have like dealt with these things. And I just think that all of these things make there's certain elements of programming languages that make it more difficult to make them reproducible.
If nothing else, just putting a spotlight on this, so at least try. There are ways to make it easier than like, do you have your software checkmarked someplace? Do you have a tag? Do you have a git commit that you can point at and say, this is what I published on?
Yeah.
Don't make it hard for yourself.
And if you're not going to use a container, like I've used containers, but I'm not sure I'll ever publish one. But making sure that all your dependencies are labeled and versions are labeled somewhere in there is important. And I mean, maybe like providing a conda YAML file or something like that for people to use is just one extra step, but maybe it's a little easier for the random researcher who doesn't use Docker, but is going to try to download and run your code in Python. They know how to do that.
It also kind of needs to be study specific, because some studies are going to be more susceptible to variation based on versioning than others. Sure. I would think that string manipulations are going to be pretty consistent, even across operating systems and library versions. But floating point operations, boy, anytime we get into that, I start getting nervous.
Yeah. So another idea for sorry, real quick, Patrick. Another idea for a seminar is, and Bennett, maybe you could lead this one, is how to write code tests for floating point information, and even better for stochastic code that includes random variables. How do you write test cases for that code? But we don't need to talk about that further now. Yeah.
Well, that we didn't get into that, but the whole reproducibility thing is like, well, if you're using any random generation anywhere, I mean, what are your seeding? I mean, are you keeping track of that?
Right.
If you yourself cannot recreate the results with your own install, then perhaps there's an issue.
Is something like NumPy's random seed, is that reproducible across platforms? Do you know? Or is that a system specific?
Sorry, I'm turned into a silent movie there. No, NumPy is just a front end to BLAS libraries, so it's going to depend on the underlying BLAS library that's installed. Most of the Conda installations now, I think Intel donated the MKL libraries to the NumPy Foundation, and so most of that is going in. The two issues that come with seeding is if you're not doing parallel, you can set the seed value to a specific number. And once that seed value gets set, it should be a deterministic chain of random numbers. The problem comes is that if you're doing anything that's doing multiprocessing, then you have to be wary of, you need to know the seed on every process and be able to set those so that you've got something deterministic. And that becomes much more difficult.
Yeah.
Back in the old days, and from friends who work in computational chemistry, typically what they'll do is that they set meaningful boundaries on the results can err by this much from our thing. And so they'll run it through 3 times, and then they have a separate program that compares the output from n runs and says, okay, what's the average deviation from some known set? And as long as it's within epsilon, right, they consider that to be okay. That's really how the numerical stability, I think, is defined for a lot of the simulation stuff that's got stochastic components.
So Bennett, so to make sure I get the answer right, so if you run random with seed starting at 4 on Linux and then take it to an ARM-based Mac, you should get the same set of random numbers if you're using the same programming language and same library.
In theory, that is true, yes.
Okay.
If there's numerical stability built into the algorithms, they should be able to compensate for differences in architecture.
Yeah.
I do know that when we were doing some agent-based models and running them, obviously there were lots of agents running, and lots of them all looking for their own random. If you change anything, I mean, you can change the order. I mean, if it needs to be the 4,632nd call to that random generator, if somebody slipped in ahead of you, you're going to get a different number.
Right.
Makes it hard, obviously. If you change anything in your code that can disturb the order of that processing, or which agent gets run first, or any of that, or that agent only triggers if a certain condition happens, and that's when the call gets made. There's a lot of variability, obviously.
So here's a controversial question: how important is reproducibility? Like, we look at this paper and the ridiculous efforts they went through to reproduce the exact same figures. Like, does it really matter? Like, isn't the replicability the important part?
I would think that's more important. I mean, because if all I want is the graphs they generated, I'll just use the graph they generated. I mean, if I'm doing this because I want to use their methods on a new set of data, or a new extent, or a new timeline, time series, that's replication, and I have to make sure that I trust their methods. So that's reproducibility. Is, can I validate that I'm at least starting at the same point they are at? So how close do you have to get before you say, yeah, that's good? I mean, do I get the means, the modes, the averages, does the graph need to look exactly the same with the same heat map and the same? Probably not. But
Yeah, there's a line there somewhere, Pat, right? Like the cosmetic differences, like Scott was just talking about. No, probably not. But if you're coming up with a completely different graph being charted that is fundamental to your interpretation of results, then I would say that that is a reproducibility issue, and you should be able to reproduce that sort of thing. So maybe it is a study specific thing on which parts of charts are needed for the interpretation, which are or versus which are just aesthetic related.
That also gets you to the issue of how do you pick the right graph? Right? If you can radically modify a person's reaction to your data by changing the units on one of the graph to emphasize or de-emphasize flatness or steepness of a curve. And so, right, graphs are always tricky because they're very easy to manipulate. I would always want to have access to the underlying numbers and make sure that that's stable, and then go back, and if I disagree with the methodology or the psychology of the graphs presentation, to regenerate a graph that I think is more honest and true to the nature of the data. Simply because I've been in meetings where I've had people try to pull the graph over my eyes, as it were. And then I look at it and I go, wait a minute,
yeah,
this,
zoom in on
this
the area
line
of
is in
interest.
integers and this line is in hundredths. And you're making this pretty insignificant difference look like it's, the 1929 stock market crash.
Yeah.
Yeah. Make sure there's all sorts of those, but that's probably a different.
Yeah, well,
different
it's a
and
great
very also
topic,
useful
though.
seminar.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I think we do have a long way to go with open science, but I do think that like studies like this make me think like you're right. Someone mentioned this is a lot of work. Can you imagine like trying to reproduce 40 different papers? Like that's years of effort. And so like I just don't know about the utility of getting the exact same results, right? Like you kind of have to there's some amount of trust you have to have, but yeah, you should be able to take that code and expand on it, right? Like that's science, right? That's how science works. You build off of the people that came in front of you. So, and I'll say, like reading these, what were these things at the end? The recommendations, the at the end, the eight recommendations. There are two of them that should not even be on here, and it shows you that we have a problem. And in my opinion, like number 7, first of all, like publishing code in PDFs is not okay. Well, no crap, it's not okay. like the fact that it say that to me seems like ludicrous. And there's another one on here that I was like, well, of course, like the fact that that's even in here.
This was
like
6
3.
years ago.
Yeah. I mean, still, but like 3. I mean, of course, if you change the source code once it's in the paper, like you need to have a reference back to the original one. There's just a lot of things in here that are like, yes, if you aren't realizing this, then there's a whole nother problem. Anyways, I thought the 8 were really informative about the state of the art that we're at, and it's a sad state.
Yeah.
Yes. I expect that those are in there because those were prevalent in the samples they were looking at.
Exactly.
The source code you gave me is not the source code you ran.
Right.
I think it's also important to remember that who does the actual work for published results? In most cases, it's not the principal investigator. And in most cases, they're not computer programmers. And they have simply not been trained. And so there are lots of things that amateur scientists are going to do simply because they don't know any better and nobody has told them anything. And so in a lot of ways, the solution to whatever this problem is to incorporate much more basic sorts of numeracy and awareness of where problems may arise as part of their training. I mean, the number of researchers that I've dealt with who have come back and said, look, we need to get papers out. We don't need to be revising our code all the time, right? When we want to update the version of Python, is about 90%.
Yeah, well,
Right.
that's kind of the one of the reasons we were having these seminars.
Yeah,
These
yeah,
should-
yeah. And
is to
so
help-
the question
help,
is,
beat
right,
the
it's
drum.
like, how do they and we, the people that they might be coming to improve their methodologies, how do we sort of meet in the middle where we don't sound like we want to, you know, completely order their lives and become Big Brother and make everything go by. And on the other hand, you know, they're not going to be able to get away with some of the really sloppy things that they could fix pretty quickly. Right. And the multiplicity of languages, the multiplicity of platforms, the multiplicity of publishing requirements, you know, are not contributing to this. This is one instance where genetic diversity may be a bad thing, right? I mean, whose guidelines do you follow here?
Yeah.
So,
We've kind of got a random forest of platforms. If we
Oh,
have enough
boy.
variations, eventually
And-
we'll find one that works.
and software versions, again,
Yeah.
referring back to the MRI literature, because it's the one I'm most familiar with. But I think there was one where there was a paper that went through, he downloaded PDFs from published MRI studies and extracted from those PDFs the reported software versions that were used for the analyses. And there was something like 14,000 combinations over 5,000 publications. So, you know, how do you even begin to approach where the variability in that is?
When we have a project that runs for 3 years, 4 years, just the what we ran with it the first year may not have a lot of overlap with where we end up being by the time we're generating the fourth publication.
And that's a really interesting question. I mean, if you've got, I used to deal with this with survey data. Michigan's got an Institute for Survey Research that's been around since the 60s. And there are a lot of ongoing studies where there are new waves every year. And if you're including a new wave with all of the preceding data, and you're updating your software and you're updating your algorithms and your methodology, how do you go about comparing what you got with the new stuff to the old stuff before you say what the new wave did to it?
Yeah. We have one where we're using National Land Cover Database, and they do updated surveys. But one of the things they do every time, let's say they do a 2006, a 2012, and a 2018. Every time they have a new drop, they say, "Oh, but we've changed our methodology, so we're going to reprocess all of the old data and all of the old drops with the new methodology." So you've got the 2006 copy, but was it the 2006 with the 2006 methodology, or the 2012 methodology, or the 2018 methodology? And it's all 2006 data output. So there's a lot of variability out there to just nail down.
And we ain't going to solve it today.
But it's good to know that it's out there, though. I mean, if the goal is to be more reproducible, rather than just saying it's a binary thing, if it's to be more reproducible and more replicatable, then keeping it in your thoughts, in your data plan. Having a data plan, how do you archive it? How do you share it?
Right.
It's a process.
Yeah. If I could real quick, I'm going to have to hop off here, but I just wanted to plug two things real quick on this note. One thing I learned at the summit that Scott and I attended is that funding agency proposals are now some encouraging, some mandating an outline plan of, okay, this is the data you're going to use. This is the data you're going to produce, and this is how we're going to store it. This is the code we're going to make and where it's going to go. And here's the output. And this is our plan for storing it in some open access repository. So those sorts of things are now becoming part of the process before the research is even done, which is, again, more work, but maybe makes it easier down the line. And the second thing, I just wanted to send this in the chat. We met Kendall Fortney, who's here at University of Vermont, and is the director of the Vermont Research Open Source Program Office. And I'm just putting this in here because he is a resource for any of us to use and to contact with questions about this sort of thing. So I encourage you to, if you have any need to reach out to him. Yeah.
And Kendall's also
Just-
a cool dude, so he's fun.
Just a real quick thing, Alexander, before you go, you
Yeah.
might want to look up pre-registration.
Yeah, right. That's great.
Pre-registration essentially says, in this study, we intend to do this, and these are the results that we expect. So that's an attempt on the part of the grantors, and in some cases, the publishers, of saying that you collected data and then you did not sit down and try to find something significant in it. You told us ahead of time why you were collecting the data and what you were looking for as a method of preventing effectively cheating.
Definitely. Yeah. Data mining.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Cool, great. Thank you for the presentation, Alexander.
Yeah, thanks for finding this. So we'll
Sure.
pick a topic for 2 weeks from now, send it out, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Y'all have a good
Take care, all.